Hello, we're back to the journey to the River Sea today. And you may remember that Maya is now staying with her rather unpleasant relatives on the Amazon. But she's found a great friend in her governess, Miss Minton. So let's go on from where we left off. Mrs. Carter was delighted to hear that Maya could not keep up with the twins. Do you remember this was a trick that Minton and Miss Minton and Maya were playing? The first real smile they'd seen on her lit up her flabby face, and she gave permission readily enough for Maya to work on her own. Of course, Beatrice and Gwendolen are very intelligent. I've always known that. She gave Maya quite a kind look. I dare say you'll catch up soon enough if you apply yourself. So each morning, Maya was set to work on the veranda at a small wicker table. Miss Minton gave her exercises and projects, and occasionally she left Dr. Bullman and the twins to see if she needed. But mostly Maya worked on her own, and she loved it. She learnt about the explorers who had braved incredible hardship to map the rivers and mountains of Brazil. She copied the drawings made by early naturalists, drawings of marmosets and tapirs and anacondas, and of the great trees which supplied the world with precious woods and rare medicines. And it was as though Miss Minton's books gave her back the mysterious country she had longed to see and which the Carters had shut out. She was told to write stories about whatever interested her. She learnt poetry by heart, and she wrote some of her own. From time to time, she'd knock on the door of the dining room where the twins were doing their lessons and ask how to spell a word, choosing an easy one so that the girls could despise her. How do you spell table? Maya would say, trying to sound worried, and Beatrice would tell her how to spell it and say, Goodness, you can't even spell that. But mostly, no one took any notice of what Maya was doing. The teaching had been good at the academy, but Miss Minton was a born teacher. Now that Maya enjoyed all her lessons, Minty insisted on an hour of maths every day. She also made her go on learning Portuguese, and Maya was about to complain when she tried out a few words on the sullen maid, Tappy, and found that Tappy understood her and almost smiled. It was because Miss Minton was determined that she should learn all about the country that she lived in that Maya had her first meeting with Mr. Carter in his study. The girls were drawing a teapot according to the instructions of Dr. Bullman, narrowing their round blue eyes as they measured the exact distance from the handle to the spout, when Miss Minton came to Maya and said, It's time you learned to draw proper maps. Go and ask Mr. Carter if there's a chart or a map of the country surrounding his house. Maya looked up, alarmed. She'd scarcely spoken to Mr. Carter, who mostly sat silent and gloomy at meals and vanished as soon as he could. Must I? Said Maya. Yes, said Miss Minton, and returned to the twins. Mr. Carter's room was at the end of the main part of the house. As Maya knocked on the door, she heard a shuffling and a rustling, as though papers were being quickly put away. Then he called, Come in. The room was dismal and dark, like all the rooms in the house, and the air was full of smoke from the cigarettes which hung from Mr. Carter's lower lip whenever he was alone. It was also dusty because he did not allow the maids to come in and clean. The charts and sail figures tacked to the wall had curling edges and looked as though they'd been there for years, plus piles of paper lay in untidy heaps on the drawers and the filing cabinets. But in the centre of Mr. Carter's desk was a cleared space covered in a white cloth, and on it were small round objects which he was examining carefully through a lens. Rubber or specimens of soil or seeds. But when she came closer, she gave a little gasp. They were eyes. Glass eyes, but still definitely eyes. And not the eyes of dolls or teddy bears. No, these were human eyes, and so carefully made that it was hard to believe they were not real. The backs of the eyes were hollowed like seashells to fit over the muscles of the person who had worn them, but the front was a perfectly copied ball. There were blue eyes and brown eyes and hazel eyes, and in the centre of the coloured part, a black pupil, which looked as though it might I beg your pardon, which looked as though it really must let in the light. "Well, as you can see, I'm sorting my collection," said Mr. Carter. He picked up one of the largest of the balls, crisscrossed in tiny scarlet veins, and held it in the light. "This is the left eye of the Duke of Wensford. He lost the real one at the Battle of Waterloo. It's worth a pretty penny, I can tell you." Maya swallowed. "How did you get hold of them?" "Oh, I have a man who sends them out from England. There's quite a few dealers in the business. They get them from the undertakers as often as not. Most people don't mind too much what happens afterwards." He put down the Duke's eye and picked up another one. "Now this one's really special. This is the right eye of a famous actress who was burnt in a fire in the theatre. Tilly Tyndall, she was called. Look at the colour. It's as blue as the sky, isn't it? You wouldn't believe what that would fetch. Of course, the really valuable ones are the doubles, but they're rare." "You mean two eyes from the same person? From someone who's lost both eyes?" Mr. Carter nodded. "I've got 3 sets, and they're worth more than the rest put together." He put out a hand towards a blue velvet box, then changed his mind. The doubles were too valuable to show a child. "I tell you," said Mr. Carter, "if this house went up in flames, it's my collection I'd save." "Well, after you've saved your wife and the twins," said Maya. He looked up sharply. "Eh? Yeah, yes, of course. That goes without saying. Now, what was it you wanted?" "Miss Minton wondered whether you might have a map or a chart of the country around the house. It's just to borrow for a little while." Mr. Carter sighed, but he got up and began to rummage in a number of drawers. "Here you are," he said, returning with a rolled-up chart. "It covers 10 square miles behind the house. Bring it back." Maya thanked him and left. She'd never seen such a sad room or such a sad hobby. But the map was interesting. She took it to her room and waited till evening when Miss Minton came to do what she called hearing Maya read. Since Maya had read fluently since she was 6, this mostly meant asking Maya what she thought of David Copperfield, or arguing with her about sentimental poems, which Maya liked and Miss Minton didn't. Excuse me. "Look, I've been trying to copy this, but it's difficult. Would you believe there are so many little rivers and streams and channels behind the house?" Whoops. Oh, sorry about that. Miss Minton bent to look. "They're called igapeth," she said, "and the Indians go up and down them in their canoes. Even the ones that seem to be choked with reeds are often navigable. It looks as though one could go to Manaus the back way, not down the main river, if one had a canoe. And if one knows the way," said Miss Minton, looking at the maze of little waterways. After she left, Maya again climbed onto the chair and looked out to the huts at the back. She'd found out how to loosen the netting nailed over the window, and so could undo the catch. She knew the lullaby now that came from the middle hut, where Tappy and Furo lived. Sometimes she hummed it herself in bed. And she was beginning to make out more and more people. The girl who had walked across the first night in her bright dress was called Conchita. Her baby was a demon, always. But Blow the Wind Southerly, the tune she had heard someone whistle on the fine first night, never came again. That Maya's lessons were so interesting was a good thing, because the twins went on being unfriendly and rude. Each day, fresh white dresses, which Tappy's young sister washed and ironed in a small steamy hut beside the boathouse. She felt hopeful. The fair girls, their pretty dresses, their pink and blue ribbons, seemed to belong to the twins she had imagined before she came. But the girls lived strange lives inside the dark and stuffy house. Like those pale insect grubs that exist only to be fed and groomed by others, the twins ordered the servants to comb their hair, pick up their handkerchiefs, iron their hair ribbons. They never went anywhere alone, following each other even to the bathroom. And when they shook their heads or nodded, they moved absolutely together as though they were puppets pulled by the same string. Yet one did not get the feeling that they were particularly fond of each other, or indeed of anyone or anything else. As for Maya, the girls never lost a chance of snubbing her or making her feel unwanted. Mostly it was just words, but sometimes when no one was there, they pushed her against the rough glass wall in the corridor or dug their elbows into her. It was a long time since Maya had thought that Gwendolyn's pinch that first day had been an accident. "Why do they hate me, Minty?" she asked, bewildered. "What have I done to them?" And as always, Miss Minton answered, "They're just not used to other girls yet. Give them time." Then, at the beginning of the following week, they went into Manaus. "Well, perhaps Maya might prefer to stay behind and rest," suggested Mrs. Carter hopefully. "Oh, no, please." "Mr. Murray has made it clear that Maya is to have dancing lessons and music lessons also," said Miss Minton firmly. Since the twins' lessons were being paid for by the money Maya had brought, there was nothing Mrs. Carter could do. They travelled down the Negro in the same dark green launch as had brought them from the ship. Mrs. Carter and the twins sat in the cabin with doors and windows shut. Maya and Miss Minton sat on deck. "Your hair will get all messy," said Beatrice. But Maya needed to feel the wind on her face. She felt as if she'd been in prison for a week. Though when they docked there, Maya had not really seen the city. Now, as they drove from the harbour in the cab, drawn by an old horse in a sun hat, she was amazed by the beauty and elegance of Manaus. They drove past mansions painted in every colour, pink and ochre and blue, with flowers tumbling from window boxes. In the gardens surrounding them were blossoming orange and lemon trees, and mangoes and wonderful creepers climbing over the railings. They passed 2 churches, a museum, a little park with a bandstand, and a children's playground. Everywhere were busy people, women carrying baskets on their heads, women with babies on their hips, messenger boys, smartly dressed Europeans, and nuns ferrying lines of little children. And on the far side of the huge square, paved in swirling mosaics, stood a magnificent building roofed in tiles of green and gold, with the eagle of Brazil in precious stones soaring over the top. "Oh, look," said Maya, "the theatre. Isn't it beautiful? That's where Clovis is going to act, the boy we met on the boat." "Oh, we're going there later to pick up our tickets," said Beatrice. "We're going to see little Lord Fauntleroy," said Gwendolen. "Oh, good," said Maya innocently. "That's the play he's got the lead in." The twins looked at each other, but they said nothing then. They drove down a street of elegant shops, dress shops and shoe shops, saddlers and hat makers. It was incredible, this luxury 1,000 miles from the mouth of the river. There seemed to be everything here that one would find in Europe. The dress shops excited the twins. They leant out of the cab, peering and arguing. "Fleurette's still got that polka dot muslin in the window. Can we go in, Mummy? We said we could shop properly this month. Can we have new dresses?" Mrs. Carter nodded. She would be able to pay off the money she owed Fleurette. Well, not all of it. She owed money everywhere, and Maya's allowance would have to be doled out carefully. Fortunately, Maya herself wouldn't need new clothes for a long time. The child was dressed very plainly, she thought, looking at Maya's blue poplin skirt and white blouse, but the materials were very good. But first, they stopped at Madame Duchamp's Academy of Dance. Madame Duchamp was a Frenchwoman who had the wit to understand that the wealthy rubber growers and merchants who had come to Manaus wanted to make sure their children missed nothing they could have had in Europe. So she ran classes in ballroom dancing, folk dancing, ballet. The class the twins went to was a mixed one for both boys and girls. There were children of all nationalities, Russian, English, French, and of course Brazilian. Some pure Portuguese, some of mixed race, Indian with Portuguese, black with Indian, for the peoples of Brazil had intermarried for centuries and were proud of their mixed heritage. Maya changed quickly into her dancing shoes and turned round to see the twins sitting side by side on the locker, their plump legs sticking out in front of them, waiting for Miss Minton to come and help them. "Miss Porterhouse always put on our shoes and tied up our hair," said Beatrice. "So did Miss Chisholm," said Gwendolen. Maya went ahead into the big room with its tall windows and the bar. It was full of chattering, swirling children, waiting for Madame Duchamp. An old lady with mottled hands sat at the piano, absently touching the keys. A tall Russian boy with red hair came over and introduced himself. "I'm Sergei," he said with a friendly smile, "and this is my sister, Olga." Maya put out her hand. "I'm Maya. I'm staying with the Carters." "Yes, we heard." A sunny-looking Austrian girl with plaits round her head came to join them. This was Netta Hauptmann. She was the daughter of the twins' piano teacher. Maya was usually shy with new people, but the relief of seeing all these ordinary, welcoming children was overwhelming, and she was soon chattering in the same mixture of languages that the other children spoke. She had not realized that every word she spoke to the twins had to be thought about and weighed. Madame Duchamp now entered, an elegant French woman of about 50, with a black bun skewered high on her head. So, now we are ready. Find a space and point the toe, please. Maya's toe was already pointed. She loved to dance. The old woman at the piano began to play a Chopin waltz. While the children danced, the governesses and the nursemaids sat on chairs round the wall. Is that the little cousin who comes to live with the Carters? A friendly-looking plump lady on Miss Minton's left said, and introduced herself. I'm Mademoiselle Lille, the governess of the Kaminskys, Sergei and Olga. Yes, that's Maya, said Miss Minton. She's charming, so graceful. Yes, she's a good child, said Miss Minton. Mademoiselle Lille looked under arched eyebrows. And of course, the twins, she added politely. They are always so tidy, so clean. Both women watched the two stolid girls revolving as relentlessly as metronomes to the music. Yes, it's difficult for them, said Miss Minton. They have not been used to having other children. But now your Maya is happy, said Mademoiselle Lille, who seemed to know a little bit too much about life at the Carters. How musical she is. She and the little Netta and my Sergei also. You must bring her to visit us. The Countess is always wanting that her children meet new friends. Music stopped. Now, you will take your partners, said Madame Duchamp. Maya looked down on the floor. There were more girls than boys. She would wait and dance with whoever was left over. A Portuguese boy with a rose in his buttonhole claimed Netta. Then she found Sergei at her side. Will you? He said. And she nodded happily to see the twins watching her balefully before they turned to each other. Oh, they always dance together, explained Sergei. I don't think they like other children. Maya was not so sure. Well, perhaps next time you can ask one of them, she said. No, they make me frightened, he said, and laughed. It was a wonderful hour. The shabby old lady had played for the Imperial Russian Ballet. She coaxed real music out of the battered piano. Maya forgot the twins, forgot the dark and gloomy house, and danced. But 5 minutes before the end of the lesson, something happened that changed her mood completely. Two men came into the room. They were dressed in black trousers, black jacket, black shoes, and as they walked over to Madame Duchamp, it was as though a pair of gloomy crows had stalked into the room. The larger of the crows put up his hand, and the piano fell silent. Both men approached Madame Duchamp and spoke to her in a low voice. Maya couldn't hear what they were saying, but she felt a shiver of unease, and when she looked, the men spoke again, and when she nodded, they turned to the class. Now, please listen carefully, said the older of the crows, as though he was speaking to a group of 2-year-olds. He had a square forehead, covered in broken veins. My name is Trapwood, and my partner here is Mr. Lowe, and we've come to Manaus on an important mission, a very important mission. We've come to find a boy who is living somewhere near here and who must be brought back to England. Mr. Lowe, the thinner, smaller crow, blinked his watery eyes and nodded. Must be brought back, he repeated in a high voice. Quickly. Must be taken back without delay. The boy is the son of an Englishman called Bernard Tavernier, who settled out here and who is now dead, Mr. Trapwood went on. He was drowned when his canoe overturned in the rapids. Now, does anyone here know such a boy? Children looked at each other. Those that spoke English translated what the crows had said into other languages, and everybody shook their heads. Well, what does he look like? Asked a tall girl. We don't know, nor do we know his first name, but he must be found. Mr. Lowe was getting agitated. His voice had risen to an even higher squeak. Still, the children shook their heads. Well, if you see anything unusual, anything at all, or if anything occurs to you later that makes you think you know where he might be found, you must go at once to the police station. Do you understand me? Mr. Trapwood, who seemed to think that the children had lost their wits. Or you can come to the Pension Maria and ask for Mr. Trapwood and Mr. Lowe. Well, what has he done? Asked a brave child, the son of the customs officer. Well, that's neither here nor there, said the taller Crow. But he must be found and he must be taken back to England. There might be good news if it's the right boy, he said. He tried to smile, but could only imagine a sinister leer. We will be offering a reward, he added in an oily voice. And remember, anyone hiding such a boy would have been guilty of interfering with the law. Which means he could be locked up, or she. They could be put in prison, squeaked Mr. Lowe. They left them, and Madame Duchamp called for a final polka, but the lightness had gone out of the day. Sergei knew the Crows. They arrived yesterday in the mailboat, and they've been prowling round ever since, asking questions, he said. Well, I hope they do not catch him, said Netta. Maya hoped so too. She hoped so very much indeed. To be found by Mr. Lowe and Mr. Trapwood and be dragged back to England seemed to her a most horrible fate. After the dancing class, the twins and Mrs. Carter went off to shop and have lunch before their piano lessons in the afternoon. Since the time for Maya's lesson had not yet been fixed, Mrs. Carter gave permission for Miss Minton and Maya to wander around Manaus on their own. You will, of course, not go into any play, told Miss Minton. And Miss said, no, Mrs. Carter, and did not bother to point out that since the Carters hadn't paid her, she could hardly afford to buy Maya a banana, let alone give her lunch in a restaurant. But they had a lovely time. It rained earlier, but now a fresh breeze blew off the river, and wherever they looked, there was something of interest. A howler monkey sitting on a telegraph pole outside the post office, a clatter of brilliant yellow butterflies drinking from a water trough put out for the horses, a pint-sized child lugging a mule on a rope. Maya bought some postcards to send to her friends and asked Miss Minton if she'd like one to send to her sister. But Miss Minton said her postcards were vulgar if she could do it, so she could do without. I think we might look in the museum, she said. It's probably free. Perhaps I could offer them my necklace. What necklace is that? Said Maya, surprised. She'd never seen her governess wearing jewellery. It's made up of all the milk teeth of my sister's children. She gave it to me as a farewell present. She has 6 children, so there are a lot of teeth, said Miss Minton in an expressionless voice. The museum was behind the customs house, not far from the river and the docks. It was a yellow building with a domed roof and the words Museum of Natural History painted on the door. Inside was a marvellous jumble of stuffed animals in cases, skeletons hanging from wires, drawers full of rocks and insects and feathers. There were 3 rooms downstairs and 2 more upstairs, which held tools and carvings made by Indians from all over the Amazon. Maya and Miss Minton wandered about happily. Some of the stuffed animals were unusual. A manatee, a kind of sea cow, which looked like a great grey potato with little bumps and knobs on its skin, and a forest tarsier. But some were just ordinary animals that people had brought in from the jungle. And in one case, there was a stuffed Pekingese labelled Billy, the faithful friend of Mrs. Arthur Winterbottom. Museums do not usually show stuffed lapdogs, but the curator was an Englishman with a kind heart, and Mrs. Winterbottom, who had raised a lot of money for the museum, had really loved her dog. Maya was admiring a shrunken head when she heard a small exclamation and turned to find that Miss Minton was standing in front of a display showing specimens of dried plants. The plants did not seem to be particularly exciting, but Miss Minton was so absorbed that Maya came over to stand behind her. The Bernard Taverner collection of medicinal plants from the Tajupi Valley, she read. The plants were carefully labelled with their names and what they were used for. A few Maya had heard of: quinine bark to treat malaria, morning glory seeds to bring on sleep, but most were strange to her. Oh, this is one of the most important collections in the museum, said a voice behind them, and they found that Professor Glastonbury, the curator, had come out of his office. He was a fine naturalist, Taverner. The professor was a big, portly man with a fringe of white hair framing a pink skull, very blue eyes, and an old linen jacket from which a handkerchief protruded. The handkerchief did not have much to do with the professor's nose. It was used to mop up dye or formalin, wrap up a delicate specimen, or wedge a rickety stand. He'd been putting together the skeleton of a giant sloth and was still carrying one of its claws in his hand. When did Mr. Taverner present the collection? Asked Miss Minton. 5 years ago, when he came back from the Tajupi. But he often brought things in. The banded armadillo came from Taverner. He never killed more than he needed, though. Once he had a specimen, he left the rest alone. He sighed, remembering the man who'd been his friend. Then the doors were flung open, loud footsteps sounded on the wooden floor, and they found Mr. Trapwood and Mr. Lowe making their way towards them. Oh, no, not the crows again, whispered Maya, and was frowned into silence by Miss Minton, who pulled her away from the display case and led her out of sight behind the manatee. Professor Glastonbury, said Mr. Trapwood, wiping his face. Black suits are not the best things to wear in the tropics, and he was sweating heavily. The professor nodded. We understand that you knew Bernard Taverner. He gave a collection to the museum. The professor nodded. Medicinal herbs, very interesting, over there. The crows looked disappointed. They probably expected stuffed jaguars and enormous throwing spears. Well, we'd like to ask you some questions about Mr. Taverner, said Mr. Trapwood. Trapwood and Lowe, private investigators. He took a card out of his pocket and handed it to the professor. The professor looked at it and gave it back. I'm afraid I'm very busy. Well, it won't take long. We know that Bernard Taverner died about 4 months ago. What we want to know is the whereabouts of Taverner's son. What we must know, squeaked Mr. Lowe, he is to be brought back to Westwood without delay. The professor blinked at him. I'm afraid that won't be possible, he said. Why is that? Because Bernard Taverner didn't have a son, said the professor. And now, if you will excuse me. I'm glad, said Maya as they left the museum. I'm glad he hasn't got a son. I don't know what Westwood is, but it sounds horrid. I suppose it's a prison like Wormwood Scrubs or Pentonville. And Miss Minton said, yes. They were to meet the Carters at the theatre box office at 4 o'clock. As they crossed the square with its tall brass lamps and flowering trees, Maya was more and more awed. Imagine Clovis acting there, she said. It's a really famous place, isn't it? Miss Minton nodded. Caruso sang there, she said, and Sarah Bernhardt came to act. She was 70 years old, but she played Napoleon's young son, and she was a sensation. Goodness, Maya was impressed. If a woman of 70 could act Napoleon's son, then surely Clovis could manage little Lord Fauntleroy. I'm really looking forward to seeing him again, she said. It's only a week now before they come. The twins and their mother were waiting. We've got our tickets, said Beatrice. We're going to see little Lord Fauntleroy on Monday afternoon, and on Saturday we're going to see Twelfth Night. That would be boring because it's Shakespeare, but little Lord Fauntleroy will be good. Yes, it is. We saw Clovis rehearsing. He was splendid. The twins stared at Maya. Oh, you aren't going? We got the tickets weeks ago before we knew you were coming. They're all sold out, aren't they, Mummy? Mrs. Carter nodded absently. She was sending the doorman out for a cab. But I promised Clovis I'd be there, said Maya, fighting off tears. I promised. Oh, he'll have forgotten, said Gwendolen. Actors don't remember people. He'll have forgotten he ever met you. And they followed their mother to the waiting car. The twins were wrong about Clovis. He wasn't clever, but he was faithful. And as soon as the Pilgrim players arrived in Manaus, he asked where he could find a place called Taparini, or House of Rest, and a family called Carter. Nobody seemed to know about the House of Rest, but he was told that the Carters lived in a bungalow about an hour's journey from Manaus and could only be reached by boat. Well, you can't go gallivanting off now, said Mrs. Godley. We've got the dress rehearsal this afternoon, and when you see the theatre, you won't want to. It's twice the size of anything you've played in before. This did nothing to cheer up Clovis, who said he felt sick. Everybody feels sick in this dump, said Nancy Godley. The company had taken the top floor of the Hotel Paradiso, which was the cheapest hotel in Manaus. It was also the worst. Grey slugs crawled over the wooden floors of the showers. The lavatories were filthy, and the smell of bean stew being tortured to death in rancid cooking oil stole through the rooms and corridors all day. "Oh, it's no good having the vapours now," said Mrs. Godley sharply. "Remember, everything depends on you. If Fauntleroy's a sellout, we can pay off the sharks and get a passage to the next place. But if not, God help us all." They had left Belem at night and in a hurry without paying the hotel bill. The scenery had only just been saved. The theatre manager had tried to get hold of it to sell, but they had managed to get it loaded onto the boat in the nick of time. Clovis sighed. He knew his lines, he knew his movements. The part wasn't difficult, and his voice seemed to be all right. It was all right most of the time, but sometimes... If only he could have seen Maya before the first performance. Maya and Miss Minton always made him feel safe. But Maya was coming, she had promised. Clovis stamped on a large cockroach making its way across the floor and decided to be brave. And tomorrow we'll find out more about what happens when the play actually is performed. So bye for now.